What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we're talking about early round draft strategy for redraft leagues. We've already done position-specific videos, but I thought it would be helpful to summarize the main takeaways of those videos and talk about general strategy to see what we should be doing overall. So sit back, hit the like button, and let's talk about some strategy. So the main thing we need to start with is the running back position. Basically, every single strategy deals with how you are attacking running back, and the other positions kind of just fit in around that. As we've learned from that research project, 2 running backs in the first 5 rounds is generally considered optimal, with hero RB being 1 running back in the first 5 rounds coming in second. So our goal should be to exit the 5th round with 2 running backs, though it is okay to only have 1 as long as that 1 running back is taken in either the first or the second round. Caveats to this would be leagues where RB0 builds are more ideal. If you don't know, RB0 builds are no running backs in those first 5 rounds. This would be exclusively done in full PPR leagues, and you would have to have the ability to start 4 wide receivers, whether that is 3 starting wide receiver spots in a flex or 2 starting wide receiver spots in 2 flexes. You have to be able to start 4 wide receivers any given week. If you are not in a full PPR league or you do not have the ability to start 4 wide receivers, RB0 is not for you. That leaves us with 3 to 4 rounds to attack with the 3 other positions if we've taken 1 or 2 running backs in the top 5 rounds. For the quarterback strategy video, we talked about how early and mid-round quarterback builds have become more successful in recent seasons. Taking 2 quarterbacks late was optimal for a very long time. For years and years, just double dipping late at the position was the best thing to do. But especially in these last 2 years, those builds have gotten crushed, and teams that have been attacking high-end and mid-range quarterbacks have been finding the most success. We also talked about in that video how I think that trend is going to continue, but the first 2 rounds, so rounds 1, rounds 2 in the draft, are way too important for running back and for wide receiver. So the earliest I would take a quarterback is in round 3, and that would only be for the big 3, Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, and Josh Allen. Lamar, Burrow, they're going to start entering the conversations in round 4 or 5. Fields starts entering the conversation also in round 5 or round 6. These are, really the only quarterbacks that I would consider targeting in the early rounds for this video. Again, early rounds is like the top 5 rounds just because of how success rate really starts to fall off after round 5. And I really do think targeting that group of quarterbacks will lead to success this season. In the tight end video, we discussed how the success of drafting 2 late tight ends in recent years has been dropping. It peaked a few years ago, but in every single year since, it has been on a downward trend. It's been suboptimal the last 2 seasons. But with that being said, please, please, please always remember, you never draft just 1 late round tight end. If you do not take a tight end early or middle, you have to take 2 of them late. Over the last few years, teams have been much more successful drafting early and mid tight ends than taking 1 or even 2 late. Early round success has been very successful, but it's worth noting that early round has basically just meant Travis Kelce, right? He's been very, very good the last few seasons. Teams that took, say, a first round tight end, well, they had a lot of success, not because, all these tight ends are going off. It's because Travis Kelce, the only one that's going that early, has been really good. This season, he's going to cost you a top 7 or 8 pick, so definitely earlier than he was going last year. If you look at the simulation research I did, that's all found on the website. I did research into how early should you be taking a tight end? Do they come out as good picks, in the early first, the middle first, the late first round? Honestly, the simulations don't love taking a tight end in round one. And that's obviously, the simulations are being fed Travis Kelce-like seasons. Like, success for first round tight ends has actually been very, very high. It's been extraordinarily rare over the last 10 years for a tight end to be drafted in round one and to be a bust. So the model knows when you take a tight end in round one, you're going to get a very, very good tight end. But even knowing that, even factoring that in, it doesn't love taking them in round one. Again, last season, Kelce went off and was worth taking even earlier than you had to take him, which, many times people got Kelce in the second round last season, but he would have been worth a mid-first round pick last season where he's going right now. But you need that sort of outcome to happen by taking him in the mid-first. And again, over time, taking a tight end that early in redraft leagues is not ideal. I prefer drafting at ADP Mark Andrews, TJ Hawkinson, Kyle Pitts, and Darren Waller, all incredibly athletic tight ends with locked in target shares who have league-winning ceilings and don't cost you one of those very, very valuable first or second round picks. Then you basically just fill in the wide receiver position from there. I didn't make a wide receiver specific video, but the data shows that going wide receiver heavy isn't super ideal for redraft leagues. RB0 has a pretty poor success rate over time, and wide receiver starts are for the most part suboptimal in every year, even in years where wide receivers dominate. It's just not super ideal to start that way again in a redraft league. You do still need to capture the early upside at the position. Like, I wouldn't want to, not draft a wide receiver until round 7, round 8. You're just not going to capture any sort of ceiling that way. But if you're going to go overboard at a position early, typically, you don't want to, in a redraft league, be drafting, 5 straight wide receivers like you might in best ball. In best ball, that can work out. Again, if you wanted to go RB0 in a full PPR league where you could start 4 wide receivers. But if we're just talking about a league where you can only start a maximum of 3 wide receivers, drafting more than that in the first 5 rounds is not going to lead to success over time. So I know that was a lot. I figured it would be good to kind of provide a blueprint of how I would attack a draft based on everything that we've, learned in these past videos, talked about in this video. What would my mindset be in every single one of the first 5 rounds? In round 1, I would just stick to the rankings. Whether it's mine, whether it's someone else's, whether it's your own that you created, you have a set of rankings. We're going to talk about basically a 12-team league here. You have a set of rankings in the top 12. Just take the top one in round 1. I wouldn't think about strategy too hard. The one thing that I would consider is that if it is really 50-50, maybe you have rankings, but it's your 7th and 8th best player are virtually tied. You didn't want it to have to come down to that, but it does. If it is a true 50-50, I would lean towards the running back position. As we said, aiming for 2 running backs in the first 5 rounds is the best outcome, but the second best outcome is hero RB. So if you start off with the running back, you now have 4 rounds to just find the best running back value. Maybe in round 2, you don't love it. Round 3, you don't love it. You're just giving yourself 4 chances to be yes, this is the value. This is the player I want to end with 2 in the first 5 rounds. But if you can't, if you go through all those rounds and you're I just hate it. I hate all these running backs. It's not the end of the world because you now have the second best start. You have hero RB. You took one in round 1. That is an okay start to your draft. But if you start off with a wide receiver, you basically just remove one of your outs. You can still do hero RB with a second round running back. It's just a little bit less ideal to do. The simulations definitely prefer if you're doing that from a first round running back standpoint. But then if you were still aiming to take 2 running backs, well, now you have 4 rounds to draft 2 of them. And maybe that's a little bit more difficult, especially, given the great players we have at other positions in rounds 2 through 5. But again, for the most part, just take the top ranked player in round 1. In round 2, take Kelce if he's there. He's almost certainly not there, but I figured I would mention it. Definitely draft Kelce in round 2. Then I would lean towards the position that you did not draft in round one between running back and wide receiver. And again, ideally not a quarterback. So if you drafted a running back in round one, lean wide receiver in round two. If you drafted a wide receiver in round one, lean running back in round two. Sometimes you will look at rankings and you will see a quarterback at the end of round two ranked as the top player. Remember, the first two rounds for running back and wide receiver are wildly successful and lead to a very high rate of league-winning seasons. You really do need those two rounds when attacking those positions to gain upside, to gain consistently, to be just like the rock of your roster. And by taking quarterback that early and removing one of those rounds, it's just not a good thing to do over time. So even if you see a quarterback as a top ranked player in whatever rankings you're using, even if they are mine and you are not in a superflex league, I would still prefer to wait, because they're not going to be like, if they're the top ranked player, it was like, at the very end of the second round. I would prefer take the top ranked running back or wide receiver, try to get a better value at quarterback. It'll lead to more success over time. And again, I would prefer to take the position you did not take in the first round. So if you started off with Christian McCaffrey, I would prefer to lean wide receiver. If you started off with, Stephon Diggs, I would prefer to lean running back in round two. In round three, I would target Jalen Hurts, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, and Mark Andrews. If any one of those four players I just mentioned becomes a value by ADP, so not if I'm at the turn, I'm at pick 25, Mark Andrews is still there, but his ADP is 32. We're still early enough where I don't want to reach half a round any of these players, but if they're at ADP, if they're a value by ADP, any of those four, I would definitely be taking them in round three. If none of them are available, my lean would be towards the wide receiver position unless a top 2-round running back has fallen. In my opinion, that's Nick Chubb, Tony Pollard, unless, you're watching this and they had maybe they re-signed Zeke or they brought in Fournette or something like that happened. But Chubb, Pollard, Josh Jacobs, if he signs, Derrick Henry, and Ramondre Stevenson. If one of those running backs is not on the board, I would personally lean towards wide receiver. I wouldn't go into that next range of running back. There is kind of a drop-off there. There's a lot more question marks, and those question marks just are not there at the wide receiver position. So the four quarterbacks and tight ends I mentioned, then is there, a second-round running back still left? If not, take the top wide receiver in the rankings. In round four, I would again absolutely draft any of the top quarterbacks. If one of the top three quarterbacks has fallen into round four, take that value and say thank you. If Mark Andrews fell into round four, take that value and say thank you. If none of those four players are left, again, it depends on what you did in the first three rounds. If you don't have two running backs yet, this is a good spot to take number two. You've waited a little bit after that, really second tier running back is off the board. A round has gone by. A few players have taken shots at that next tier, but you weren't the first to do so. There's still some really, really good running backs available. So if you don't have number two, we're in round four, you see one you like, that's what I would do next. If you already have two, then I would just take your top ranked player between Hawkinson, Lamar Jackson, and a wide receiver. I would much rather target, an elite quarterback, an elite tight end, or get a potential stud wide receiver than taking your third running back in the first four rounds. You now have too many running backs. You've missed out on ceiling for something, whether that's ceiling at the tight end position, whether that's the ceiling for drafting a quarterback that could finish, with a league winning season. You draft a Justin Fields and he ends up, just running for 1,500 yards, a Lamar Jackson who runs for 1,000 yards, throws for 30 touchdowns, something like that. You've missed out on both of those. You've now waited another round before taking, really good wide receiver. It's now multiple positions you've avoided in the early rounds to take effectively your flex position and a player that you can't even put in the top two running back spots because you already have that. So that would be my lean in round four. Then finally, round five, it again definitely depends on what you have. If you don't have two running backs, make that a priority If, again, you took a running back in round 1, it's okay to not draft your second in the top 5 rounds. But especially if, say, your first running back came in round 3, I would make it a priority to get your second one in round 5. If you do have 2 running backs at this point, my first thought is quarterback. I would definitely take any of the quarterbacks that I've mentioned plus Joe Burrow, because I haven't said his name yet. If that is not an option, then see if Hawkinson fell. If that's also not an option, my lean is wide receiver. There are just some fantastic wide receivers on the board in round 5. And while there are going to be some options at tight end, again, if Hawkinson is not available, like that next range of tight end, they're going to be in that range. But you're going to have really good options in round 6, round 7, round 8, maybe even round 9 to attack the tight end position. Wide receiver is just such a gold mine in the 5th round that if you don't need your second running back, if a really good value at quarterback or tight end is not there, I really would be wanting to draft a wide receiver. And honestly, my hope is that you already have those 2 running backs by this point, because I would way rather take a wide receiver that is going to be very, very good than a running back in round 5 that, let's be honest, the success rate of running back in round 5 is definitely not as high as we would like it to be, and it's definitely not as high as it is at the wide receiver position. And that's another reason, again, we lean running back when we can in round 1. It not only gives you that out of hero RB, but there are just so many elite wide receivers in rounds 4, 5, 6 that I would so much prefer that I'm attacking wide receiver with a few of those and spending at most one of those rounds on a running back. The last thing I want to talk about is in regards to like the specific players that you'd be drafting, because we only really talked about positions right now, but what are we really thinking about when we're drafting players in these first few rounds? The first 5 rounds have a significantly higher success rate and lead to significantly higher league-winning seasons than any other round. And in particular, the first 2 rounds have an incredibly high success rate. But that also means that misses hurt a lot more, in the early rounds than they do the late rounds. If you miss on your 12th round pick, it basically doesn't impact your team. Like, it has almost no impact on your success. You can easily drop them, pick someone else up. It really does not matter. If you drafted someone like Najee Harris last season, that hurts. Like, that hurts a lot in your first round pick. An exercise I like to do in my head is to think about, how could a player bust? Like, I'm sitting there, I'm next on the clock, there's 3 players that are available. Start thinking about all of the different scenarios that that player could have a disappointing season at that ADP, like in the context of the ADP. And if you're just listing off reasons left and right, like, well, I guess this could happen and this could happen and that could happen, and the reasons aren't injury, like they're like, oh, well, maybe the offense is trash, and well, do I actually even like this player all that much? Like, I think they're good, but how good? Are they actually very efficient, or is it just all volume? Like, if you keep listing things off and you don't feel great about them as a pick, please pass on them and just take the highest ranked player that you do feel good about. You should feel very confident in every single one of your first 5 picks. So if you ever don't, then please do not just draft someone that you don't like just because they're the top player in whatever rankings you're using. You should love everything about a player in the first 2 rounds and virtually everything about a player in rounds 3 through 5. Again, the first 2 rounds, if there are things about a player that you are not in love with, there are so many awesome players, just take a different one. If there's something you don't like, take a different one, even if they're the top player in the rankings. In 3 through 5, at that point, there are going to be some issues. Like, there will be a problem with every single player in round 4, round 5, right? Like, we don't have, like, they'd be going in the first 2 rounds if everything about them was incredible. So you can be, a little less picky in 3 through 5, but it should only be like one thing. You should not be listing off a bunch of things that you don't like about a player in round 3, 4, or 5. If that is ever the case, take a step back. draft someone you do feel good about. Sometimes that's not going to work. Like sometimes you'll do that exercise and you'll end up switching to a player who has a bad season. Maybe you look back and you're like, wow, wish I just stuck with the rankings. But I promise over time, you're going to feel much better about your teams if you don't just blindly follow whatever rankings you're using, especially in the early rounds. So that is how I would approach the early rounds. Over the next 3 Wednesday videos, we're going to take a deeper dive into how this general strategy changes depending on if you have an early, middle, or late first round pick, with a few example teams that you could draft in each of these spots, depending on if you have the 1 pick versus the 12 pick. How does strategy change depending on those two? So make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any of that. Also, if you want to play around with how optimal different positions are in the early rounds of the draft, you can see that and my exact rankings for all different formats on my website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That, my friends, is in this one. Hope you all enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting the like button? How about subscribing to the channel if you're new here? Thanks for watching.